Welcome to Hummingbird, a community education podcast capturing conversations between colleagues, friends, and community leaders that bolster our understanding of ourselves, of others, and of our communities. Listening to histories from trusted sources helps us learn from experiences across generations, disciplines, and points of view in ways that supercharge our capacity and effectiveness. My name is Elizabeth Allyson Crawford, or Zelle for short, and I'm your host for this episode of Hummingbird. I'm a teacher, a dancer, and some other things, but most importantly, I'm a child development specialist with a focus on intergenerational well-being. I'm originally from Boston myself, although these days I call New York City home. Today, I'm very happy to introduce you to my friend Bill Walczak, a community leader, public health advocate, and educator in Dorchester, Massachusetts, specifically the neighborhood called Savin Hill. Bill was born and raised in New Jersey, but it seems like he's from Boston now after decades committed to local communities there. Bill is most associated with the redevelopment of the Codman Square area of Boston, a multicultural community which was founded in the 1970s and became an area known for racial unrest and economic disintegration. Bill was founding president and CEO of the Codman Square Health Center, a major factor in the regeneration of the community, is founding president of Codman Academy Charter School, and most recently was CEO of the South End Community Health Center. He's been president and CEO of healthcare organizations for over 40 years, and while he's technically retired from regular employment, he has a very full dance card and writes a weekly column for the newspaper The Dorchester Reporter. Bill is an advisor and trustee to many important local organizations, including Bunker Hill Community College and the Massachusetts Business Alliance, and has worked on multiple gubernatorial and mayoral transition committees. Bill has supported community regeneration efforts in a number of countries around the world and was involved in the Northern Irish peace process for over a decade. He's received numerous awards for his work and ideas. The themes of this episode with Bill in 3 acts are the importance of context, Bill's claim to fame about how to get things done in Boston, discussions about proximity to power and the value of practical dialogue and decision-making, and the human element in good governance. To offer some personal context, I first met Bill when he was serving as CEO of South End Community Health Center in Blackstone Square, on the block occupied by the Blackstone Public School. The health center is a unique place-based solution providing education and community health services in the same building, adjacent to Via Victoria, the oldest community development corporation in Boston, traditionally home to predominantly Puerto Rican and Korean immigrants. Together, Bill and I worked on what he reminded me was a very tricky project to put 0 to 3 services inside dead space in the health center that had been used for storage for years. In the course of our conversation, Bill's memory wins the day time and time again with a crispness that I can only hope for in my late 70s. When we begin our recording, I'd just given Bill a small gift of something called the Match It game, produced by our friend John Swabish at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., a master of data for visualization, so please look him up. In response, Bill got excited about charts and started telling me about a centuries-old drawing that shows human losses in the Napoleonic Wars over time. So without very much editing, I welcome you to listen to our extended chat as we cover a wide range of interrelated topics from early childhood and public health services to issues with Boston Public Schools, local real estate interests, and doing work in the context of broad mayoral control. When the mic turns on, you'll hear Bill say, and it comes back as a single line, as he's describing the colossal casualties suffered by the French under Napoleon's leadership. But he does it with a characteristically bright tone, which is one of the many things that makes it a joy to talk with Bill, his underlying belief that whatever the challenge, we can learn something from it. It's always interesting to hear Bill talk about his work and perspective, and this time, thankfully, I remembered to bring the mic. At the end, we've included a special 10-minute outro in which Bill explains the details about Boston's strong mayor system of governance, so stay tuned to the end for a great civics lesson that relates to today's local elections and a spot-on impersonation of past Mayor Marty Walsh. To read Bill's weekly column in the Dorchester Reporter, visit .news.com. That's DOTNEWS.com. Thanks so much for listening. Stay tuned in general at Evolution Forward on Instagram, here at the Hummingbird podcast on YouTube, or online at www.evolutionforward.org. Here's Bill.
Comes back, and it comes back as a single line. And it's like, wow, that's war. That is very meaningful in terms of understanding, right? That he started off with 400,000 soldiers and wound up with like 1,000 or so. Lost all of the other soldiers along the way from cold, disease, and fighting. But anyway, that's a fascinating one. And it was done in the mid 1800s. So it was like a
simple,
really, kind of.
Works.
It works because you look at it, and after about 3 minutes, you say, "Oh."
So it takes 3 minutes to digest a good chart. Is that
good
what
chart,
you think?
yeah.
Okay.
And I think of all the charts, like the Boston Foundation is very fond of putting charts in their annual reports and the reports on housing and stuff like that they do, and they do a fairly effective job. You can look at their charts and understand what they're talking about. The big issue, of course, is like when you get into epidemiology and stuff like that, where p-values are the important thing, and when you look at that kind of stuff, you say, maybe.
We had a lot of conversations about things like that in that fellowship. So I'm actually doing a test recording right now, if that's okay. I'm just going to say we started chatting about the magic game, which is what we were talking about. But I'm going to pause now and then we'll really start.
Wait. Hold on for a second.
Okay.
Just so in case you have any ability to help with this. I was informed yesterday that my band is going to be playing at the Boston Public Library in the what do they call that? The center area where the people go outside and inside.
Which library?
The Copley.
The main one.
The main one, yeah.
The Pueblo Library.
Yeah, right. And it's like concerts in the whatever that's called.
Copley Square, the town square.
Yeah, but it has a revolutionary theme, and it's anticipatory to the 250th anniversary of the revolution, right? Okay. So we're coming up to that. But a lot of the stuff happened in Boston, the Boston Tea Party, all that kind of stuff that happened just last December, the 250th. But anyway, so they want us to have a revolutionary theme, but it doesn't have to be a revolutionary in terms of the American Revolution. It could be revolutionary thought, revolutionary this, revolutionary
How about evolutionary thought? How about revolution means to turn over, right?
Yeah.
To revolve, like a revolver.
That is a really good point.
So it means to change ultimately. And I think if you read the beginning of, I forget what's the author's name that wrote the John Adams.
McCullough.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In the beginning, he has a good line on a page. It's like a blank page. And it was like somebody asked John Adams like stuff about how the revolution started. And then John Adams says, the revolution was in the minds of the people before it was an action, right? It was in the minds of the people. So if we look at that as we do from a social change perspective, it means there was unrest. And there's a need for change when there's unrest.
Right.
If it's mismanaged the way the British did, in my opinion, it goes badly, you know. So I just read this book on the Boston Massacre for my birthday this year. Isn't that a silly thing to do? Yeah. But it was really interesting because she talked about it from a family sort of integration perspective because there was this co-mingling in Boston, which was very small then, of British soldier families and governing families, and then us, who we would have been. Right? I don't know who I would have been. But anyway, I've been thinking a lot about that idea of like when people say, because they make a mistake and call us a revolution forward. And I always say, take the R off. It's an evolution, not a revolution. But I don't have a problem with the word revolution, except that it seems to imply war.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
But the Latin root means turning.
Yeah. Revolve, right? You're right. Yeah. So that's an interesting idea, because maybe we could turn this into an evolutionary kind of thing, because it is. This is one of the things that I always focus on when I talk about things is context, because we oftentimes miss the context. Why did something happen? Well, there's a whole story behind that. How did you get to that point? And it has more to do with evolution than it does revolution.
It totally does.
Yeah.
And I think that's when I think of John Adams saying it was something in the mind first, right? It was something in the air, in the water, that there was something wrong.
Especially in New England.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So
not in New York City, by the way.
Oh, this gets complicated, Bill. We can go wherever you want. I don't mind starting with evolution. But
well, here actually, I think you gave me a book once, so I'm going to give you a book.
Okay, I'll take books from you anytime.
It's one of the more impactful books that I've read in the past 10 years. So
okay, that's a good recommendation. Then I'll take it.
He's a good writer too. He's lives in Maine. I don't know where he's from originally, but he's mainly a journalist. It's a fascinating book to me. Fascinating.
A history of the 11 rival regional cultures of North America.
Yeah.
I feel so uneducated. I've never heard of such a thing.
It's a fascinating book because
at the map.
It deals with in fact, he says that who gets elected president has to do with which of the nations become collaborators in this. That they see things from very different perspectives, but they have certain things in common. And how they interact and who they decide to vote on determines who gets to be president of the United States.
Mm-hmm. You're saying still in this kind of format.
Yeah.
Still in this map.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that the Puritans settled mainly Massachusetts and Connecticut and then spread out across the country, mainly in the northern states of, Michigan and northern Ohio, Minnesota, Illinois.
Yeah,
but
my father's family is from Iowa.
But not Indiana and not Iowa. Well, Iowa somewhat. Iowa somewhat.
They pushed them to Minnesota.
Right, yeah.
Oklahoma.
And then out to the West Coast, in Oregon and Washington. Almost all of the colleges that were created by New Englanders out in the West, in the Northwest. In Minnesota, Carleton College, all those colleges were created by New Englanders because New Englanders believed in universal literacy so that everyone could read the Bible.
Yeah.
And it's something he doesn't deal with, but we dealt with at one point because after reading the Benjamin Franklin book by Walter Isaacson, I came to the conclusion that Puritanism was really the foundation of the nonprofit sector. Because it really is, it's a Northeast kind of thing. When you think of Benjamin Franklin, well, he was kind of a Northeastern guy. And in his life, he wrote about how his family had just a couple of books. They had the Bible, of course, but they also had Cotton Mather's book, Essays on Doing Good, which was, if you were doing good, it meant that God had decided that you were going to heaven.
Right.
And if you weren't doing good, it meant that God decided you were going to hell. And so everyone strived in that. And I see that as kind of a fundamental thought process for how do you, whether you are going to be acting good or striving to be good. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so that's, but that was my own theory. And I actually gave a talk about that at the, of all places, the Christian Science Church.
Of all places, the Christian Science Church. Now, I can imagine when you give a full talk on this, and it's not just off the cuff, because this is what we're talking about when we sat down, you can talk about a wide range of perspectives on that, right? Because I could imagine a wide range of perspectives on that because you have this. So I've spent a lot of time in Puerto Rico. So I'll just say one of the first things that comes to mind is the colonization of education, something to that effect, the colonization of the mind. And you're talking about religion now too. It's very interesting, to think about what information is being disseminated nationally when those are the roots. What does it really mean to get an education? And part of this podcast, Hummingbird, is to, bring what things I've learned from you, but also some other ones to a wider audience, because I think sometimes we learn faster like this than we do in higher ed and in more useful ways. So I guess that's in a way to say thank you to you for everything we've done together. And I did suggest we talk about South End Community Health Center maybe as one point of anchoring our relationship, but also, you know, what do you think, what's your commentary on that sort of spread from the early days, you know, in the Northeast through education across the country? Like, what does that mean for us today?
Well, if you read the book,
I
will. What he talks about is the fact that there was a particular view of the Puritans and how places are settled is really important. Who settles them? Because the people that come later kind of assimilate into that culture. So one of the things I've noticed is that growing up in northern New Jersey, which is a suburb of New York.
What town are you? Yes, exactly.
Well, basically Rahway. I grew up right next to Rahway in a place called Island, which most people never heard of. But anyway, you know, World War II, post-World War II boomtown. Everybody's father was a soldier, you know, all little houses all next to each other. But northern New Jersey is part of New York. It's a New York culture, right? And so, but from the perspective of, you know, what does it mean for the fact that the Puritans settled New England is that the Irish, when the Irish came in the 1840s and thereafter, they were assimilated into a Puritan culture, even though they hated the Puritans, they hated the English, but it was still a Puritan culture. The Irish that came into New York are different than the Irish that came into Boston. They're just different. And it's because they came into essentially a place that had Dutch culture and English culture and was just very, very different. And the people that came into Virginia are very, very different. How you enter into a place affects how you think. For a lot of different reasons. It's what you see, it's what you hear, it's what you're educated. You know, the Irish came into the Boston public schools. They immediately kind of backed out of the Boston public schools to create their own school system of Catholic school system. But in fact, all of that influenced the way in which people thought, people acted. And so from the Puritan perspective, Puritans, you know, weren't. I mean, people are either not all good or not all bad, right? You know, so the Puritans also hated Native Americans and were really afraid of them and sought to get rid of them, slaughter them. But on the good side of that, they were also people that believed in common good. That was part of their religion, the common good. And so the common good meant they believed in taxation. They believed that people should have access to education. One of the early laws that were passed by the Puritans required every town and village in Massachusetts to have a school. That's something that didn't happen in the South, pretty much at all. I mean, really, it took centuries for that to develop, and federal policy. But in any case, the fact that, you know, everyone was expected to be literate meant that, you know, in the 1600s, the most illiterate place on the planet was Massachusetts and Connecticut, which were the Puritan states. And so what does that mean? What does that mean for the future? Well, it means that somehow education is important, but it also means that, you know, having the infrastructure of education means that the immigrants that came in got doses of whatever that belief system was, whatever Horace Mann, who was a state senator from Framingham, by the way, when the Massachusetts created the first education system in the country.
And a school that I would know the name of being born and raised here, Horace Mann.
Yeah.
You know, that comes to mind immediately.
Right. And the school that he created was Framingham State, became Framingham State. But it was a normal school and was to teach teachers. Anyway, it was the first teachers' college in America. Anyway, so just interesting. So after he wrote the bill for the Massachusetts legislature to adopt, to create a universal system of education for the state of Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Nobody really knew what that meant, so he was asked if he wanted to be the first commissioner of education. Eventually, he wound up in Ohio, Antioch College,
My college state, Oberlin.
So he was the founder of Antioch College out there. It's kind of interesting. And Ohio, of course, was originally part of New England, in that the Western Reserve of Connecticut was actually Ohio, northern Ohio. And so even though Antioch's in the southern part of Ohio, you look at Oberlin, you look at all that stuff, it's really kind of the vestiges of what in that book is called Yankeedom, which does not include New York City, by the way. It includes northern New York and New England is basically what he calls the origins. Does it mention
Oberlin? Do you know?
I don't know.
There's a really interesting educational history to Oberlin too. Controversial, but interesting missionary.
Yeah. Oh,
based. Yeah. Also, aluminum was discovered on Oberlin grounds.
Wow.
It's fascinating. Huh?
As the Brits would say, aluminium.
Aluminium.
Yes. Aluminum. I heard that the other day, and I was like, "Oh man!"
Don't confuse me, Bill. It won't go back the correct way. Aluminum. But yeah, interesting. Okay, well, did I interrupt you? We were on the Puritans.
No, but I'm just saying that it was a fascinating book to me, because when I looked at it, I said, "Wow!" I mean, and there was some things that I never knew. I never knew that the Deep South was really founded and created by essentially the second sons of the plantation owners in Barbados. Barbados was the wealthiest part of the New World at the time of the settlement. And because the primogeniture, the first sons would get the plantation, the second sons had to go somewhere. They wound up going to the Deep South and recreating the brutal slave culture of Barbados in the southern, the Deep South, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Just a fascinating part of that story, because that part of America was not interested in universal education or the common good. That was really an aristocratic. The reason why they joined the revolution, the American Revolution, was because the British royal governors needed soldiers, and they started promising slaves freedom if they would fight for the British cause. And that immediately brought the southern states into the Revolutionary War, and also was the basis for how the Constitution got developed. Reading recently about the Constitution and how slavery was protected, and it was protected because James Madison, who was a Virginian and wanted the Constitution to go through, was told by was it Patrick Henry, I think, was one of the main slavers, which is kind of surprising, and others, and Lawrence, I think his name was, in Virginia, that unless they protected slavery, in the second, that's right, it's a book about the Second Amendment that I'm also reading at this point, and that unless they protected the militia's ability to put down slave rebellions, that they wouldn't join the Constitution, wouldn't join the country. And so they placed in there the Second Amendment, which was a way of assuring the southern states that they would be able to keep their anti-slave militias. So fascinating stories.
Complicated roots we have here, sure aren't they?
There are 11 of them, apparently. Although there was a book, I could show you a book that came out in the 80s. It was called The 9 Nations of North America, which was just kind of a photo of clipping, kind of a screenshot of then in America, what were the different areas of cultural areas of the country, of the
different maps are always fascinating to me. So I love you just handed me a book about our nations and a new map, because this will get me nerdy later. But no, this is great. Thank you. And it'll commemorate our interview.
Yeah. So anyway, so context, all this started with talking about context.
Yeah. Which is what we always do, right? And we always just jump right into that and what's going on. And I think a lot about First Nations erasure in these stories, and being an education person like you and I think both can call ourselves education people, public health education people, maybe. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I've always tried to link public health and education.
Yeah.
That's kind of my thing, right? It's like, could we figure out a way of pulling them together, because they're both very powerful in terms of how people live their lives.
That's right.
And they're also, jobs. So, so producing those jobs in low-income communities and getting low-income residents the opportunity to become those professionals is, to me, kind of a critical way of dealing with poverty issue. And I've kind of spent my life trying to figure out how to deal with poverty.
I know, me too. And I've got a little ways to go, I hope, but we want to pick your brain for everything we can. I'll tell you, that's exactly what we've learned too in Evolution Forward's first years, is that we started saying we're an education network. And now we really have to say, we're an education and public health network. And sometimes you lead with the public health in a public health environment and sometimes education. But I agree with you. And it's kind of this interesting thing where we have to say both. There's a Venn diagram. How do we work in the middle, to make sure that all those things are considered? I think the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Fellowship changed my thinking so much, because I went into it as a baby person from an education standpoint and came out with this public health awareness, that sort of allows us to talk like this, I think, in a different way. So for me, that's a vote for interdisciplinary learning, and development. So
and I went into healthcare.
I asked you how you describe yourself, and it's complicated, right? You have to say education and public health, right?
Yeah, that's what I've spent most of my life doing. Right. Although community development I see as an essential part of that. Whatever, and it's a broad definition. All these things are broad definitions for me.
So here's what I was able to do.
I was able to get education, all these other things, by just making healthcare the broadest possible definition.
Yeah, and I understand what you mean by that, because I've understood it coming through the doorway of social determinants of public health, because how your early childhood environment goes is one of the social determinants of long-term health outcomes, right? So that's
and it's why I ran for mayor, frankly.
Is that why you ran? See, this is why you're the baby guy. I tell people Bill Walczak's a baby guy, and they don't know you that way. But then I try to tell them our work together, and it makes more sense. So
I ran for mayor because I realized that politics was an essential part of producing the kinds of services and opportunities that low-income people needed in order to be able to, to succeed. And that having a police department that doesn't interact well with low-income communities, having a school system that doesn't produce what low-income communities need, having social service systems that are just not terribly relevant to what's needed. All of these things are guided by politics, are guided by decisions made by politicians. And I thought, well, geez, if we could just get somebody in there that wasn't just beholden to the status quo and started moving things around a bit, or looking at, to me, what I wanted to do is I wanted to audit the entire city of Boston, not from a perspective of whether the dollars.
That's why you didn't win.
There's a lot of reasons I didn't win. But I can tell you that, that if we audited the city of Boston, we would find millions and millions and millions of dollars that are wasted because we always start from the perspective of the existing, the status quo, and then it's an add-on from there. We never question that status quo. We never question whether those dollars are being used in a reasonable way. We always just start from there. And as a result, there's a continuous need for expanding the pool, and therefore, when you need to cut, it's those extra things that get cut first. Mm-hmm. So if you want to have like community health workers or something like that, there could be dollars available during good times, and as soon as the bad times come,
it's always the community health workers and the navigators that get cut first,
exactly.
Right? And that's what you and I were kind of advocating for in our small way with Room to Grow and South End Community Health Center. This is what it says in the world about you on Wikipedia. Bill Walczak is a community activist in Boston, Massachusetts, United States. He was a candidate for mayor of Boston in 2013. So if you were grading my interview, I think we've covered those things. That is your
I know.
Well, 2-line bio, but it goes on to talk about, you're missing some cool things, because I think the New York Times, is it the New York Times Magazine article about your marriage with
No, it was in the vows section.
It was in the vows section.
Yeah,
okay,
vows,
whatever it was, it has this beautiful picture and a nice description. Unfortunately, it's behind a paid firewall, but it's a really nice
Luckily,
article.
I bought some copies of that.
Okay, well, we might have to bootleg it up on our website then or something. It's very lovely. And I know you have a wonderful personal story about all of that, but I feel like these things are interesting because I describe you as a community organizer. I feel like that's what comes first. And I think I only know that from having done a project with you, a significant piece of work, because it's never easy to implement things, right? And so I think part of why, and maybe I can get us to talk a little bit about South End Community Health Center history, because that's where we met, really, is when you were doing that. And just because we're pretending there's other people in the room with us, what year was it, do you think, that we actually met? I can't figure it out.
So it was, let me think, 2015 when I started at the South End Health Center.
And so it was not that long after that.
And so it was probably 2016 or so. Yeah,
something 16, 17. Because we were looking to move Room to Grow, nonprofit organization 0 to 3 services, from a space that was above the Club Cafe. Did you know that that's where it was?
Yeah, I did know that, but I forgot. Yeah.
So, we all know the service access issues with that location as program people in Boston, right? It just wasn't the best spot. And also, and this is what I wanted to reflect with you on, is the sustainability of the overhead, paying market rate rents in Boston as a nonprofit organization. So I really feel this is like a chance to share some context, but also to thank you for taking us under your wing and making that project work to bring Room to Grow into the Blackstone School under the South End Community Health Center as a partner. Because I think we did a good job with that. I think that's very sustainable. I was just
not only that,
in there the other day and I thought, for heaven's sake, who has free rent in Boston? And I never really thought, I knew it's one of those things where that it was a good idea, right? To bring those organizations together. But it was so hard just to build out 3,000 square feet with BPS as the landlord and contractors doing work. And even with your help, I think you laugh at me because I gave the contractors a hard time on project management to get it right. But, I just thought maybe we could wax poetic on doing these projects in Boston. But I think it's sustainable. And I was in there last year, just at the end of the year, talking to one of the program people at Room to Grow. And I hadn't been there in years. I wanted to tell you this. And she was interrupted by a staff member from the health center who had come across the hallway, basically inside the building, which is place-based strategies, right? Very interesting. And comes over and says, I want to check these 3 names with you to make sure that my referrals from South End Community Health Center got through to Room to Grow, and just follow up and make sure there's nothing else we need to do to make it work. And the person I was talking to said, just a minute, she checked her thing. And
that sounds like competence.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I wanted to call you on the spot and be like, I think this moment of these 2 people talking about those 3 moms, to get community health center services and a 0 to 3 support program inside a public school that needs those things in Boston, with the overhead being sustainable. I thought maybe I should pat us on the back for that once and, move on and do the next thing. But I just wanted to see what you thought about all of that. And I wanted to tell you that story, and thank you for your help. But, it was tough, but I think it might've been worth it.
Yeah, I know. Well, there's a couple things that, that, first of all, my claim to fame is that I was always able to figure out how to get most things done, right? And there's like different strings you had to pull at different times. There was different people you had to get to. And I never was taught this stuff. I had to learn it, and I had to learn it really early. But so I started the Common Square Health Center when I was 20, and when it opened up, when I think I was 23 or something, I became the director of it because we had no money, and I took a leave of absence from a job. So
it says that on Wikipedia.
It does it?
Yeah, it's very funny. You should hear it. Hold on, let's pause. Wait, it says, I'm going to find it right now because it's going to make you laugh, and then you'll finish this story. Okay. It says you're a resident of Savin Hill, originally from New Jersey. You came here on a BU scholarship, but dropped out after 1 semester to work on the lettuce boycott of the United Farm Workers.
Wow.
Is that true?
That's true.
And then it says that you founded and ran the nonprofit Codman Square Health Center for more than 30 years. And then it just talks about Codman Square. So it doesn't tell the real story.
Yeah, right. I know. And I'm actually thinking about that.
I want to hear the lettuce story someday, but let's talk about the Codman one, because that's
So, I wound up getting married really young. I was 18 when I got married, and I married a Dorchester girl. And that's how I wound up in here. She had an aunt that was moving out of the city, out to the suburbs, when everybody else was moving out to the suburbs near Codman Square. And so we wound up renting an apartment for $75 a month.
Amazing.
And I, as a dropout from college, I was working as a spray painter and getting involved in the community, because being a spray painter, I can tell you, is a really boring job. But I was also a community activist when I was a kid, when I was in high school, especially.
About what?
Well, anti-war, pro-civil rights kind of stuff.
Okay.
We had my school,
New Jersey.
Yeah, New Jersey. My school, a Catholic boys' school, that was very leftist in its orientation. Although, as soon as we left, my graduating class was the last graduating class where there was kind of this leftist thing. And the reason why it was a leftist thing was because at the time they would draft deferments if you were a school teacher. So all these people that would normally never think of teaching would wound up teaching so that they didn't have to go to Vietnam. So they had a particular perspective. And they used to bring us to various anti-war demonstrations and civil rights things and all that kind of stuff. As soon as we graduated, the parents were furious with the school, and they brought in a hard hammer kind of guy that changed the school, completely changed the school back into, traditional Catholic boys' school. But we had an amazing run for the 4 years we were there.
Okay, so the activist Bill just slipped through the New Jersey education system.
Right, yeah. And so I wind up here, and of course I knew about Cesar Chavez. I go to the Newman Center, which is the Catholic thing at BU. Jim Carroll, the famous author, was the priest, and he brought Cesar Chavez there. So it was, so we were asked about, could we do this? And at the time, I met my wife when she picked me up hitchhiking. These are all like interesting baby boomer stories. Whenever I say hitchhiking, people are like, what?
This sounds like I'm going to need to come back again.
So she picks up hitchhiking. We wound up deciding to go out to Colorado to help organize. Our dates were like handing out flyers at A&P stores, right?
I love it.
And so we wound up going out to Colorado to help organize the lettuce boycott out there. And but because we were Catholic, I said, well, we should get married before we go out. Right? And something that I would have killed my children if they did something like that. But nonetheless, it was true. We got married because we were Catholics, and moved out to Colorado to do the organizing work, and then came back, moved into Codman Square, in the Codman Square area. And I got involved in the local neighborhood in my spare time. And at one meeting in December of 1974, which is coming up 50 years, there was a meeting to talk about what to do about the soon-to-be abandoned Codman Square branch library. The idea came up of a community health center. I asked a bunch of questions. I was considered to be, this radical. I had long hair and stuff like that. So I was considered this radical by the Civic Association there. And the woman who ran it, Marge Muldoon, basically put me in charge of the committee to start a health center. It was a way of kind of shutting me up, right? So it's like,
me do work. If you have that much energy, Bill, why don't you take on some of the work? I've been in that position myself. I think I'm realizing you and I are peas in a pod.
So anyway, so that's, so she winds up appointing me the chair. I wind up organizing the group. I've never taken a course in community organizing, but
I did once with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but I learned more from you.
But community organizing is really about just building relationships with people and having a vision or a goal or even a concept about where you wanted to go, just like even a basic concept. And so in April of 1975, which is less than a year from now, we incorporated, and because I had done a lot of the work, I became the president of the corporation. Right, it was 20 years old. So anyway, but that was how we started the health center. I wrote a grant proposal and wound up getting a job at the Dorchester court for a community restitution program, and then I left that I took a leave of absence to start the health center, figuring that we didn't have any money, but at the time my rent was $50 at the time.
Gosh.
And so, and Linda was working. She went back to college, and she was working, and I was, working too. And I wound up taking the job at the court, but I took a leave of absence to start the health center up.
Okay.
And then I thought I'd be there for 6 months, but I stayed for 30 something years.
30 years, yeah. Exactly.
So, okay. But so there were two things that first of all, I think that one of the greatest values that I brought to that organization was the fact that I was not trained as a healthcare person. I eventually got a bachelor's degree in history from UMass Boston. Took me a long time, but I eventually got that. I believed that I should get one. Actually, it was really the courthouse that kind of forced me to finish up all my incompletes. But nonetheless, I wound up getting a bachelor's degree. But going into this, you could see, what are the real problems, And so after starting a whole bunch of new programs, I realized, and then getting back to the South End, I realized that it's really difficult to run a multi-service organization, right? So you can kind of grow past the medical model and do certain things, behavioral health. You can add a bunch of medical services and stuff like that. You can get into community organizing. We had community organizers on staff. We had people that were organizing crime watches and stuff like that. We could get into that. But once you got like kind of a step past that, like running a fitness center or a grocery store, something like that.
People really need for prevention and general daily health. But
better to do it as a partnership than to do it on your own. And at the time, the real estate was really cheap in Common Square. So I bought a bunch of buildings. And then, for instance, there's the building that's now Daily Table, which is a, fantastic nonprofit grocery store that only sells nutritious food. It's just great. And the HealthWorks Fitness Center over there. Well, that was, luckily I didn't have to pay a dime for that. I raised the money. I got a grant to buy the building. And so, all I had to do was raise the money to, to put the various programs in. But I didn't have to run them. I had people run them that knew how to actually run those things. And so coming into South End Health Center, my lesson learned over that 30-year period was that, that best to build partnerships to provide the services with people who are passionate about that particular thing that you would like to see get done. I recognized really early on that early childhood is so important and that the school system doesn't really do much about that, right? So, the school system starts at age 4, which should start at age 3, but for whatever goddamn reason there is,
this is where you and I meet soul to soul. Because when I started here, anyone I hear speaking like that feels like a kindred to me. Where can we start solving this?
Right.
So,
yeah. And when we had all that money from the pandemic, I kept on writing about how important it was that we just go down to K0, right? Let's do K0, add another step into it. The schools can handle another grade down, but, it's so difficult to get any kind of change to the status quo. And so it's just so annoying because we could have done it. We could have done it during the pandemic and we didn't do it during the pandemic.
There were so many things like that too. And I think like to focus, because there's so many macro problems we can't solve in our lifetimes probably. But what we did do, I think, is drop a little bomb of light into the South End Community Health Center of 0 to 3. Right. So now I'm realizing why we were such a great fit, because I came saying, I want to do this thing in a different way and we need a sustainability strategy.
Well, I was looking for ways for the South End Health Center to do more with early childhood.
Yeah.
And I actually met with Jack Shonkoff and all these other people.
We all were meeting with all the same people, you and I remember it, and trying to figure out how to work together in Boston. Right.
And I realized that there were a lot of organizations that were doing that stuff and that health centers weren't known for doing it. So it was going to be difficult to raise the money for it. And so I was looking for a partner to do that. And then you showed up.
saying, knock, knock, hey, Bill, I need some space and good partnerships.
Yeah. And the fact that it was early childhood stuff was like, okay, let's do this. Let's get this done. And everything I've ever done has always been problematic. There's always been some reason why things, could have easily not happened, including the Common Square Health Center.
That makes me feel better when you say things like that, just so you know. So keep saying them.
There is nothing that I've done that was easy. Nothing. It was like, it's all difficult. And when I have a group from Chile coming to Common Square in June. And they always assume that somehow the government came in and just built all this stuff. And it's like, God, the government did nothing.
So much
really.
work.
We had to fight the government in order to get stuff. Yeah. And granted, if you get government money, it usually sticks around for a long time. So there's nothing like government money. But, oh my God, dealing with the bureaucracies were impossible. Mm-hmm. So we wind up with that whole situation where all of a sudden the Build Boston Public Schools with
put out that RFP.
Yeah, with Rob. Well, with
process?
Rob. Well, it was worse than that.
You're jogging my memory. I forgot about that completely. But there was some change right before we were trying to do what we wanted to do.
They decided they weren't going to move on anything in the Boston Public Schools until they had a comprehensive plan for every piece of real estate that they had.
I called it an RFP. I think you had to apply all of a sudden or something.
But our particular school wasn't even on the agenda. This is when
I called you. I tapped out. I think I tapped out. And this is the story for me because I'm remembering now how close it was to being impossible.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it was one of those things where, I talked to Rob Consalvo, who's now state rep out of Hyde Park. But at the time, and he was the chief of staff for the Boston Public Schools. I can't even remember who the commissioner was at the time or the superintendent was at the time. But anyway, it didn't matter. The reality was that they were never going to be able to use that space.
Yes, it was 3,000 square feet, to be clear, of dead space.
Right, that was behind the health center.
Right next to the health center. Right. All we had to do was create a process with 2 registrations or something up front.
But the other issue was that you had to go through the health center to get to it. So the only way that was ever going to be used was with a health center focused kind of thing.
Exactly.
That was the only way it was going to be.
This was the magic of the concept.
But Rob Consalvo says, we're not going to allow anything to happen there because we don't have a comprehensive plan. And I said, you can't possibly use it without kicking the health center out. You're not going to kick the health center out.
It's going to be dead
That's
for a long time.
That's never going to happen,
and it was dead before. How long was it dead for a while?
Oh, it was storage from the beginning, from when that childhood center came in.
It was exactly what I was looking for because in a city like Boston where the real estate is so precious, and accessibility to multiple neighborhoods is so difficult to figure out, you're looking for something like that, dead space.
Right. Yeah, right.
Dead space that no one's using.
Can't possibly be used.
The head of the health center would love to have the partnership back there, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
0 to 3.
It made sense to me, to put this in there because it was early childhood, plus the connection with the pediatric program and the school and all that.
This is
was
like the first
no-brainer.
Do you remember who introduced us or how exactly we met? Because I don't.
I don't remember either.
Me neither, but it felt like this.
Yeah.
What's going on with 0 to 3 and how do we do space in Boston, right? So so then this is the part where you made it work.
Yeah. Well, could it have been, what's her name? Kennedy, Joe Kennedy's
Lauren Kennedy? Do you think Lauren Kennedy?
I mean, because she came out and talked to me.
It could have been.
Yeah, she came out and talked to me about it. There's a funny story about that was she comes out and she's talking about building a early childhood center or whatever, a daycare center.
Yeah, neighborhood villages.
Right, yeah, the villages thing.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking at that point, it looked like, maybe they could take the 3,000 square feet and put it into a daycare center.
Lauren Kennedy was the nicest competitor I ever had because we were all just trying to figure out what would be best for everybody. Right.
And then it kind of.
I don't think she could have fit in that. I think that's
probably maybe that's what happened. Mm-hmm. But because it was just too small.
It's very small.
But in any case, she comes out and I remember sitting there. I had no idea who she was. In fact, she was introduced to me as Lauren Birchfield.
Right.
Okay. And so anyway, she's there and, and I said, well, geez, there's space here. And actually there's space in a bunch of schools, if you look at it, because the numbers are going down, dropping like a stone in the Boston Public Schools. I said, but do you know anybody political? And she said, well, my husband is Congressman Joe Kennedy. And I said, well, that changes everything.
Well, Bill, I love that you don't do too much Googling of people before you meet them. I think that's a really good, a good quality.
It was one of my board members was friends with her and said, could you meet with this? They're looking at daycare centers. I was like, okay, sure, I'll be.
You know what? They just put out, Neighborhood Villages just put out a list of criteria to hold your children's books up to, kind of thing, multicultural.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was great for us because we're putting out this Afro-Latin dance children's book now. So I think we're all thinking about,
they're working out of John Finley's.
Yeah, that's where the other room to grow site is. Yeah. Remember that? There's one office there. There's this tiny little satellite there. So those were the two that we
John Finley's one of my favorite people.
Well, let's get John and we'll tell the story, the three of us, next time for part 2.
Yeah.
But okay,
so anyway, so
we were almost not going to be able to get room to grow in the health center
because of the bureaucratic thing.
Red tape change at the 11th hour.
Right. And we had already made the decision to hire Commodore Construction Company.
We were ready to go.
Commodore was ready to go.
Yeah.
And Marty Walsh used to be the head of the Building Trades Council.
This is where I want Boston people listening to this. This is just what cracks me up.
So anyway, so I decided to, even though like Marty, I actually ran against Marty Walsh for mayor. But I called up Marty and I knew one of the things that was going to be important to him was this, union shop Commodore Construction Company, Joe Albanese. And so I call him up and I say, Marty, I have a early childhood program that's in space that only the South End Community Health Center can use. And Build BPS is telling me I can't do it. And I have Commodore Construction right now ready to go. And he said, you have Commodore Construction ready to go? Early childhood thing, it was seemed to be.
Are we allowed to say this?
No. I like Marty, but I know, his whole life.
We are, right? We are allowed to say. There's nothing we can't say. It's about doing deals, right? I mean, honestly, it's what Hamilton on Broadway is about. It's about how do you get things done,
right?
And it's a little bit of an ugly truth sometimes that you have to do. But the reality is, someone like me, I don't even have a pathway to that phone call.
Yeah.
I met Marty Walsh after that at an event I think you sent me to, and I introduced myself and said, thank you.
Yeah.
And he knew what I was talking about.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
But Marty, this is where relationships are so critical. And I appreciate that you have them because it allowed us to move and to get this good thing done that now I'm looking, years later through a pandemic is still there, is still healthy, is still functioning and doing co-located early childhood and community health services.
Yeah.
And then we managed that Commodore contractor really tightly, because whoever we're going to work, you and I are.
We chose the contractor,
pretty intense
or you chose the contractor. I forget how it worked, but choosing the contractor was completely irrelevant to this. The fact that Marty Walsh knew Joe Albanese and that Commodore was a union shop meant a lot. I knew that it meant a lot to him because that was his life up to being mayor, was really being associated with the building trades. Okay. It was all building trade stuff that he did. His uncle Pat was head of the laborers union. And, so he grew up with that. He worked for them until he became a state rep. And even after he became a state rep, he was still head of the Building Trades Council.
Right.
So anyway, bringing that up, all of a sudden it was like he overruled the Build BPS people.
Right.
Laura Perrill.
I've had it.
Laura Perrill, who was the interim superintendent of schools, resigned a few weeks later.
That's right. We were in a very interesting moment.
Right. And
trying to deal with BPS.
And I wonder whether the fact that Marty Walsh overruled the Build BPS thing that she was running had something to do with her deciding to leave.
There's something to that etiquette that you have at least a dialogue, maybe. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
There's a reason you stay in touch with Marty Walsh, so that I always felt there's a reason that Bill stays in touch with Marty Walsh, so he can make a call for the greater good at the right time.
Yeah,
on a Hail Mary.
I've actually never asked for anything personal in my life from anybody. Just like, could you get a job, whatever. It was always, for that. I always
help
felt,
us figure out a way to do this.
It's more
like
yeah.
that.
Yeah. Or, just like, hey, we really need to have this in fill in the blank place or whatever. But, to me, it's like, there are people out there, and I learned really early that there's really nothing fair about anything.
You make me feel better when you talk like this.
Yeah. It's like you look at it and say, fair? Come on. But, because some people have just closer ability to be closer to decisions than other people. A lot of times it has to do with money. I learned that in politics, the donors really do have access, and people that aren't donors have to fight to get access. And that's just the way it is. I mean, because our system of politics is run by money. And so, and that's just the way it is. So you can rail against it, or you can try to figure out ways around it. And since I don't have money, the way to get around it is to have righteous causes and be able to, know people well enough to be able to pull some strings.
In network language, Bill, they call you a network weaver. How about that?
I haven't heard that term before.
I think of it like a hub, like you're just super, connected. And if I called you and said, look, we're really having trouble with this. Do you know someone we could talk to? You'd probably be able to say, go that way.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
At least in our education and public health realm, social justice organizing realm. And it's a pretty broad network that you have. So when it comes to problem solving, that can be a useful thing. You know who to call and you have the number. Sometimes.
Yeah. I collect numbers.
I know you do. Here's one of the questions on my sheet that I'm going to ask you right now. How many contacts do you have?
I don't know. It's north of 10,000.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you asked me for my email when I transitioned from my last role. You were like, give me your email address.
Yeah. Oh, I keep things up.
You're very good at that. And I have learned from you by watching. So I've done a relatively messy but good job.
I have a group of people that ask me all the time, do you have this number for so-and-so? And it's like, I usually do, but overall, it's not, I can honestly say that I have these relationships because I like people.
It has to be.
I like people. I think people drive me. It's, whatever I've done, it's always been a relational kind of thing. And I enjoy people. I'd rather be with people than not be with people. Yeah. I was just telling Meg actually before. I said, the last time I went we were thinking of going to London. She's now on the board of a museum in England, of all places. Wow. So anyway, so we were going in Bath, and we were going to.
I know Bath. I've been there.
It's Bath.
Sorry.
Bath. Anyway,
Bath, my American accent.
I've never been there, but it's actually close to like Dorchester and Weymouth and all these other places, that are now here.
Interesting.
But anyway, so. But I was explaining that the last time I was in London, I was with Joel Abrams, who ran the Dorchester house. Yep. And that he got really sick. We were coming back from South Africa, and he got really sick. And I said, geez, I really didn't enjoy London that much because I was just by myself. I need somebody to be with in order to enjoy places. And that's just me. I'm a people person.
There are more, I guess, socially active people like you and I, and sometimes it's helpful to get some things done.
And relational stuff makes the world go around. How gets things done. And to me, it's like if you have, I've always looked for the righteous cause, and even when I was doing stuff, it's just like, what's the human element of this?
Yes.
What's the thing that's going to prompt somebody to make a decision? Yeah. That's in favor of a particular thing. And I learned that. Over the years. I still remember, some of the stuff you just kind of accidentally come out. I'll tell you one story. Yeah. Really early in my, after I became the director of the Codman Square Health Center, there was a lot of controversy on the Codman Square Health Center. There were a lot of people completely opposed to allowing the Codman Square Health Center to open up. And eventually we fought the good fight, and, it was a mistake. We had a press conference against Mayor White, for God's sake. So eventually we won that. And, and I've also been somewhat fearless in being able to, go after people of power, including one time, which could have resulted in injury. But anyway, but we finally get our open doors, and there's this grant called the Matching Grant Program. And it's a match with a hospital. And at the time, we were getting a whole bunch of things from the Kearney Hospital, like, our payroll or, supplies, blah, blah, blah. And so this is 1980. Okay. 1980.
I was 1.
Okay. I was
hanging out on Cumberland Street in the South End.
I was 24 or 5.
Cool.
Yeah. Anyway, but so I hear about these matching grants, right? So I go to the city government and I say, now, of course, when the health center was dedicated in 1979, as the president of the board, I spoke and I said something that Mayor White probably didn't appreciate, which was basically the community does these things, no thanks to government, because the government had withheld their approval of that for 4 years, and people were just pissed, really pissed, including me. So anyway, as a result, we got nothing out of city government, so we had to fight for everything we got. But we had the space, and they weren't going to kick us out because, it would look bad. The optics would have been really bad.
I always say it like this. Bill Walczak copped a squat in Codman Square Health Center, and he wouldn't leave. So that's why it's still there today. Yeah. Fair enough?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. But anyway, so this matching grant thing, right? So I go to Lou Powlick, who ran that department in City Hospital. And I asked for that, and they said, no, sorry, there's no money. And I said, what do you mean there's no money? Every other health center gets this matching grant. I was like, sorry, there's no money. So we're at this meeting, and I announce that I'm going to be looking into the reports of all the other health centers to find out where they get their money from. You wouldn't believe how contentious that was, right?
You just said you were going to look at the financials.
Right, I was going to look at the financials. Of
course, we have to realize how contentious this always is.
Right. Well, and they were all available through the rate setting commission, right? So I knew all I had to do was go to the rate setting commission. So anyway, I wound up getting threats. This guy, Dan Driscoll, calls up and says, Bill, if you go through with that, your colleagues will cut your balls off, he said. And then Jim Hunt, who is the head of the Mass League of Community Health Center, calls me up and says, your colleagues are going to skin you alive if you decide to move forward with it. Wow. So I'm thinking, what are they hiding? Right?
Wow.
So I go to the rate setting commission and I look up the reports and I learn nothing. I knew everything there already. I knew exactly where the money was coming from. There were no secrets.
No secrets.
But they thought there were secrets, right? Everybody thought they had a special deal.
Me.
No, I'm not kidding.
You're kidding me.
So
they thought they had all these handshakes, but actually it was just clear public.
It was pretty clear.
Information, no shenanigans.
No shenanigans. It was everybody was getting something.
I've never heard this. Some
people had bigger grants than other people.
Okay.
And that had to do with their relationship was with Boston City Hospital.
Okay.
This Boston City Hospital claimed several health centers.
In a valid way? Like they,
yeah.
Okay.
They
not
had
like in a handshake deal.
Like, for instance, the Kearney Hospital was responsible for Neponset, Dot House, sort of Dot House.
I see. Okay, so geographically.
Yeah. So part of it was geographic. Harvard Street was part of Boston City Hospital.
Meaning who's serving where.
Right. But Boston City, because it was a political place, had bigger grants. They had much bigger grants. All I was looking for was the matching grant that everybody else got. And so anyway, so I get a call from Lori Berry, wonderful person, a lot of fun. She eventually ran the Lynn Health Center. She was out of California. She was just a fun person, when older than I am. So she was in the hippie, kind of era. Anyway, but she calls me up and says, Bill, can we meet? Lou Powlick asked me to meet with you. I said, well, sure. Can we meet at Brothers Restaurant in Mattapan Square?
Your memory is fantastic.
I said, sure. So we go down there and she says, Bill, what's it going to take so that you don't look at the documents of the other health centers? That's what she says. And I said, I want the matching grant. And she said, okay, you can have the matching grant. I had already looked at them.
I was going to say, I would have just said, well, I already looked at it.
No.
I know. This is why you're better than me.
So she says, okay, this is a deal. All right. she was trying to keep me from looking at these documents that I'd already looked at, right?
Meanwhile, you're
I was happy not to look at them again.
Secret.
Right.
So it's strange, huh?
Right, yeah. So we get the matching grant out of that. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, kind of was like, wow, this is so interesting. It was like my first real political lesson, when I'd started a program that wound up with the Boston Globe kind of story as a result of it. And then all the other courts wanted to have this program, so
what program was that now?
It's if you go along the highways, you'll see these white vans where people come out and, it says trial court of whatever.
Okay.
And people get out and they clean basically the sides of the highways. I started that program.
Okay.
It was a community restitution program. And it's another interesting story.
I know. I feel like we could never come home.
So I was a student at UMass Boston.
Yeah.
It was 1975, I think. And, so I was president of the health center board, but the health center didn't open until 79. So I was taking classes at UMass, and I applied for a summer work study grant, which I received. But in the spring, I had been going to community meetings, and at one of the meetings, there was a woman named Rita Thornton, who was an older woman at the time. She's probably 20 years younger than I am right now, but she was an older woman, and she was mugged in Cobden Square. And I remember her saying, they caught the kid that it was basically a handbag snatch. So they caught the kid that mugged me, and we went up to the court, and I left the court before the kid. The kid left the court before I did. Mm-hmm. I'd be happy if they just made him clean the parks, right? And I'm thinking, why? I wonder if they do that. So I was taking a course at the time with Judge Jim Dolan, who was at the Dorchester court. And it was at UMass. It was like a 2-credit course. And so the next day, we just happened to have a class meeting. And I went and I said, I was at a meeting last night. I explained the Rita Thornton story. And I said, do you have a program like that? It seems like makes sense, right? And I said, kids need to understand that they're not just committing a crime against a person, they're committing against their community.
Mm-hmm. Context.
Right. And so you need, So, it would be good to do that. And he said, geez, no, we don't have anything like that. And I said, I'm getting a work study program, this thing, and I'm allowed to do it in the community. Would you be interested in it? And he said, sure. If you get the work study, come and see me. I get the work study grant, and I go to see Judge Jim Dolan. And so I go into his office and I say, geez, I got it. It started, my father gave me his car. So I have a car so I can, do that kind of stuff. And he said, well, I misspoke. He said, I'm not the presiding judge here. You need to go to see the presiding judge and get his permission for it. And I said, well, where's he? And he said, he's next office over, Judge Paul King. So I said, okay, so I go over to see Paul King. Now, my hair was down to my shoulders at the time, right? He hated long hairs. He just hated long hairs and non-supporters. It was his thing, right? He was a smoker. He used to smoke like this, chain smoker, like this while he was talking to you,
Wow.
Geez, Allison, So I go over there and, I tell him about this, grant and this idea. And he looks at me and he says, I'm just not interested. And I said, what do you mean you're not interested? He said, I have a grant. And he said, I'm not interested, like that. And I'm like, holy crap, So I walk out the door because I thought it was a great idea, right? Yeah. And I walk out the door and I remembered that a few weeks before that, I was at a community meeting and there was a woman named Kit Clark that was there who seemed to be very important. And after I talked to her, she said something about, hey, you seem to have ideas. If you you need any help on anything, come by and see me. She had an office up on Bowden Street over here in Dorchester. So I decide I'm going to walk up to her place. So I walk up because I didn't have my car or something, but I walk up to Bowden Street and Kit Clark is there, right? There's a whole bunch of things named after her now. She died young of lung cancer. But she was the head of the Republican City Committee. She lived here in Savin Hill. And therefore, she knew all the Republicans, right, including, Governor Sargent and, Ed Brooke and, all these people that, the really important Republicans who were all decent people in those days. And and she had a party over here on the beach over here in Savin Hill every summer. And all of the big Republican, the Mucky Mucks, what's his name? Elliot Richardson, people like that would come to it. Anyway. And so Judge King was appointed by a Republican governor. Okay, so that's important. So I go up and talk to Kit Clark, and I tell her about the idea. And she said, that's a great idea. And she says, and Paul King, really? He said that? And I said, yeah. So gets on the rotary phone, calls up. This is Kit. I want to talk to Paul King. Like, just like that, right? And so Paul King obviously gets on. She said, this young kid up here has this idea that's going to clean the parks in Dorchester. And you said no? Blah, 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 blah. You know, I went on for a little bit, and then she hung up and said, go back and see Paul King. So I walked back to the Dorchester court. I walk into his office, and he said, you didn't tell me you knew Kit. And I said, of course, I was, like, who was Kit Clark? And I didn't know that she was that powerful, you know?
What? That's funny, because that would have happened to me if I tried to go to Marty Walsh by myself. And I would have had to come back looking for a friend. And at least you didn't make me go take that meeting on my own. Kit's tougher than you are.
Yeah.
That was great. You got to have a link in a way, right? There's these links.
Yeah, right. Some kind of thing. But, but
people who think differently will have different links, and you have to find ways to be able to collaborate.
What is it, right? And what's going to make that person want to say yes, right? It's like this. They have interests, and obviously this guy was a political guy because judges are political people that know governors, education, and these different things that she's been involved in.
And of course, Codman Academy.
And Codman Academy, right? Yeah. But anyway, but beyond that, what I think I've learned over all these years is that most people are decent. They want to do the good thing. I haven't met too many people that I would consider evil. A few.
Difficult, maybe.
Yeah, right. Difficult people. People have their own particular interests. They have their own successes. And, Marty Walsh, he's a decent person, right? He really is.
What do you think he would say if he listened to this discussion?
I think he's a person that would say that, that he always tried to help people that were trying to do good things for their communities. And it's true. I mean, he was a really good state rep. And, even he would visit places that he didn't even represent and be helpful in terms of trying to get legislation or, dollars for,
and do you think he would be understanding of, this struggle that it is to get things done, and sometimes why you got to call and
although he was he would maneuver his own way around for different purposes, and so having him as mayor, even though I ran as another candidate during that election that he won. Talking about two things that were of interest to him. One is doing something good in the South End.
Yes.
And second thing is helping out a construction company that employed people that were in the trade unions. It just kind of, that matchup right there.
Matched.
Right. It, resulted in an action that resulted in room to grow to have space in the South End that connects to a community health center and to a school. Yeah. I mean, so, so overall, that's, the secret sauce or whatever about getting things done is figuring out how to maneuver and what other people that you need their support from would find to be successful. How do they define success in this particular thing? Why would they want to help, right? A good story is always a good story. And I've always found that if you can produce, like, for instance, if I brought a doctor along with me at a different thing, it would always wind up. Actually, anybody who ever came out to the Codman Square Health Center, any philanthropist who came out to the Codman Square Health Center would wind up funding the Codman Square Health Center. They would look out there and they would see that it's an area that has a lot of poverty and all that kind of stuff. But beyond that, there's a good story to be told, and it looked like there was action going on that that they could participate in. And those are all kind of key elements for getting things done, right?
Absolutely.
A good story, something that could be done, something that looks like it's really going to get done, because the people don't want to put their money or, into something that might not happen. They want to make sure that it's a done deal. And so how do you kind of work those things? How do you maneuver that? Can you get some government money first in so that you can say, okay, well, hey, we have this, or you actually buy some piece of property And then, then all of a sudden it sticks out like a sore thumb because it looks like a mess, and you can go to your government and stuff like that and say, hey, we need some help on this. Choosing stuff, how we wound up with Larry Fish as being our head of our capital campaign, the chair of our capital campaign. It was a fascinating story, right? Can I finish with that one?
Yeah, okay. Please. This is your time.
Larry Fish, new head at the time. He was in the banking industry for a really long time, but new head of Citizens Bank of Rhode Island, which is now one of the nation's largest banks. Right?
Is that true? Yeah. That's trivia I would never have known. Okay.
It was a tiny bank out of Providence.
I was in Rhode Island in a meeting yesterday at Roger Williams University.
Yeah. Oh, really? Yeah. I've been there. Yeah. But anyway, so Larry Fish had, I think he had been turned down to be the head of Bank of Boston. He wound up doing some interesting stuff after that. He wound up calling up Kristen McCormick, who ran Federated Dorchester Neighborhood Houses, and wound up working at Federated Dorchester Neighborhood House. I wasn't sure what he did, but I think he was actually just trying to get in the community, clear out his mind and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And then he gets the job offer to go to Citizens Bank and works some sort of deal with the Royal Bank of Scotland. And all of a sudden there's money. So he decides to buy his way into the market. And the first place he bought into was Boston 5 Cent Savings Bank, which happened to have a branch in Codman Square.
Huh.
All right. So everybody knew Larry Fish was a good guy. He was kind of mysterious to us in the neighborhoods, but he was, everybody knew he was a good guy. And so we needed somebody that had a corporate, whatever, CEO title kind of thing involved in it. And Arlene Fortunato, who now is the development director for Bay Cove, was my development director at the time. So she says, we should go after Larry Fish. And of course, everybody was going after Larry Fish after he announced he was taking over this bank. But she sent down a bouquet of balloons to his office saying, welcome to our neighborhood. We look forward to doing business with you. Right. And so, so the couple of days later, I make a phone call to there saying, I'd like to meet with Larry Fish. The person answered the phone said, you and everybody else. And I said, yeah, well, we sent you the balloons. And, oh, you sent the balloons. That was so nice, like that. And so we wound up with our foot in the door. And then Larry sent out 2 people that worked for him, Faith something or other, and Jim Dorsey were the 2 people that I remember. Jim Dorsey lives over in Jamaica Plain now. But they were work for him at Citizens Bank, and he sent them up to check us out. What's our story? At the time, we had a building that looked like, bombed out World War II, that wound up being our main building.
And was that the library building?
No. We were in the library building, but this was the building next door. It was the nursing home, old nursing home that was abandoned. We had purchased it, but it's, we had no money to do any development of it. And in fact, we used all our money to buy that, which was a really smart thing to do. But
sounds like you, Bill.
Yeah. But anyway, so he sent these people out, and he decided this would be a good thing to kind of reestablish Boston 5 Cent Savings Bank as part of Citizens Bank and all that, and became the chair of it. And we were able to raise like the first $7 million to build out one of the floors of the building and, be able to move our clinical services over there. But it was just that little thing, right? It was like Arlene, saying it. Our people there's a lot of wisdom out there. Humans have a lot of wisdom.
Yeah.
They can be a pain in the ass at times, but they do have a lot of wisdom. There's a guy named Steve Sidlovich who was involved for a very short time with the Codman Square Health Center board. And when we were finally at wit's end trying to deal with the city of Boston, that we were trying to get space inside of an otherwise abandoned building. There was like a tiny program with 2 people in it that was in there in the old Codman Square branch library. And we're trying to get the basement space to be able to open up a health clinic of all things, and getting nothing but problems from City Hall, right? Steve Sidlovich suggests, I think he was like 17 years old at the time. And he says, why don't you have a press conference, but have it on a weekend? Because during the week, government is operating, things are happening, business is going, and so the news is all for that. But on the weekends, they all look for something to broadcast. There's always a news broadcast. So we wind up having our press conference condemning Mayor White on, I forget, it was a Saturday or Sunday, but in any case, we wind up with good publicity from it. And as a result, Mayor White's people called us up and said, the mayor wants to meet with you.
just something as simple as that understanding to switch the news cycle to the weekend.
Yeah. Well, but it was this young
mountains.
kid.
And it goes to show, where does the wisdom come from sometimes? It comes from, whoever is paying attention and has a good eye, I think.
And so that's, so we met with the mayor, right? In the Eagle Room in City Hall.
Really good.
It was the first time in my life I'd ever been in City Hall. And he's, he's there and he says, so, what do you have this? And we talked about the health center and the fact that people were going to emergency rooms of hospitals to get basic primary care and blah, blah, blah. And he said, but what do you want from me? And I missed the point. He was saying, I don't know whether it was King Louis XIV or somebody, but
victorious.
He was like, l'état c'est moi, right? L'état c'est moi, the state, it is I, right? I mean, that's what he was saying, but I misunderstood it. I said, geez, we don't want anything from you. We want to be able to use a city building.
There's a couple different ways to read that phrase.
Right. So I said, we just want to be able to use a city building. But he meant, that's my building. Because I am the city.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Anyway, but then he wound up giving us some money. Why? Because it was the year before the election. And everything that happens during election year is actually set up the year before the election year. So Mayor Wu right now is setting up her election year, to run for re-election. All that's happening now.
Yeah.
And so that was going on. So he provided some money and we had a dedication of the building 3 days before the 1979 election. And that was all intended. Kevin White coming out.
Context, huh?
I did this, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So,
well, as fundraisers, nonprofit fundraisers, I consider myself one. You have to be. We know about some of these things, and sometimes it's about cutting above the noise. I love the balloons.
Yeah, no.
I was talking with my mother this morning. We're old school. We think a good thank you note in the mail goes a long way. So I don't know, but it's really good to hear these stories from you. And is there anything we should know about Boston? Since we're on Boston mayors, you mentioned Michelle Wu, new cycle. I know last time you were very unhappy with voter turnout.
Oh, it's horrible.
What's your call to action around this next mayoral cycle?
I actually did run, and what's today? Thursday? So on Monday, I got reelected as president of the Columbia Savin Hill Civic Association. So
congratulations!
Of course, I was the only candidate.
It's a big job.
It was like the old Soviet system. But anyway, it's a good neighborhood from the perspective as a lot of activists here, and there's a lot of really smart activists here too. But in any case, I really want to introduce things through civic associations because sometimes our elected officials have other agendas, right?
Yep. So
when I wrote a piece before the last mayoral election, which was Wu versus Anissa Sabi-George, as saying that we needed to get rid of the municipal election year and just have all the elections in the even-numbered years. Because there's twice as many people who vote in even number years as in odd number years. Twice as many, because there's, the Senate, the president, all that stuff is in those years. And I asked Michelle Wu and Anissa Sabi-George if they would be in favor of that in order to increase the turnout, because the turnout, even for a mayoral election, is like around 30%. And I calculated like 400,000 people didn't vote in this election. This enormous number of people didn't vote. And anyway, and they both said no, not interested. So,
changing election cycles, not a simple thing, huh?
It's people know how to get elected when there's a turnout of X number, and they don't know what would happen if all of a sudden
if there were real
twice as many
representation.
People, or had twice as many people voting.
Yeah,
right. So that's obviously a problem for incumbent people. Incumbent elected people have an understanding of where their votes come from, and messing with that is problematic for people, for elected officials. On the other hand, from the perspective of democracy, it would be nice if we had 60% of the people showing up rather than 30% or even less.
Yeah.
In non-mayoral election years, the turnout can be between 7 and 15%.
Okay.
The last time an incumbent mayor of Boston lost an election, the last time, 1949, James Michael Curley was mayor of Boston. He had just come back from Danbury Federal Penitentiary for fraud. I think it was mail fraud or something like that during World War II.
Oh, Boston.
He had served part of his term. Johnny Hines, it's a longer story, but Johnny Hines wound up becoming the interim mayor while he was serving his term in prison. And the promise was, and actually Tip O'Neill had something to do with this. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the Massachusetts House at the time and had to work a deal with Governor Bradford, one of the old Yankee governors that was here, because at the time, if you were sent to prison or died or whatever, the head of the president of the city council became mayor.
Okay.
But the president of the city council was also being sent to prison for a completely different thing. And so they didn't have a third person. Now they have the city clerk. But at the time, Johnny Hines was city clerk. And so they had to work a deal because Johnny Hines said, I'll do the interim mayor as long as I can go back to being city clerk. So they worked that deal, passed it through the legislature, crisis averted. All of a sudden, Mayor Curley, or James Michael Curley, gets released from prison on a compassionate thing from President Truman, based on the fact that James Michael Curley was dying of cancer. He had cancer, blah, 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 right? So he gets released from prison, and on the drive back to Boston has a miracle cure. No cancer anymore.
I see.
Okay? Mm-hmm. So it was like, wow, he's cured. Wow, all it took was that drive from Danbury prison. So he comes back in and goes back into City Hall and comes out after 5 hours, and he had been in prison for 5 months. And he says to the media that's there, I've accomplished more in the past 5 hours than has been accomplished in the past 5 months. Thereby insulting the hell out of Johnny Hines. Johnny Hines goes home, and I know his son is still alive, Barry Hines, and he starts cussing, using the F word and stuff like that, stuff they'd never heard out of his mouth before. I'm going to kill the bastard. I'm going to whatever. And he decides to run. And he runs against James Michael Curley and wins the election. It's memorialized in the book The Last Hurrah, which became a movie with Spencer Tracy in it. And although he's Skeffington in there. And that's the last time an incumbent mayor of Boston lost.
And that is a really scary fact.
Exactly. The mayor of Boston is so powerful.
I'm going to go out on this one because I don't think, even as someone born and raised in Boston, I would not have understood all of these things if I hadn't had these conversations with you and read your writing and stayed in touch, because I think I'm going to admit this as a human, that we learn from each other in a really powerful way. Yeah. So
the reason why that's the case, the mayor of Boston is called the strong mayor system, right? There's actually a type of system for governance that Boston adopted. It's a strong mayor system, meaning the mayor has virtually all the power. City council has very, very little power. And as a result,
that's what I'm referring to. The mayor, strong mayor system.
Right.
Okay.
The mayor, therefore, if you're going after an incumbent mayor, you're not going to raise money, because nobody is going to give you money, and then you lose, and then they're out for 4 years. They get nothing out of City Hall.
It's a fundraising problem. It's a fundraising problem, right? And the only reason Marty Walsh left is because he moved into another role, right?
Yeah,
and that shook up Boston in kind of an interesting way.
All of a sudden, there was no incumbent.
Yeah, and now the nerds like you and I are wondering: is Boston gonna what pathway is Boston gonna proceed on in terms of the role of the mayor, which has such a big fingerprint on what happens here? But it's interesting.
Yeah, Michelle is. It's really interesting. She's kind of alienated the development community and then has tried to kind of pull herself back into the development community. The development community is what funds Boston elections.
This is the linchpin, is the real estate, which goes back to what we talked about from the beginning, is how you get stuff done in a building in Boston.
Exactly. You hire the right lawyers and you make the right kind of contributions to the incumbent people, and you usually get what you want.
Or for me, I just call Bill Walczak and say, can you handle this? And the answer is yes. So, well, anyway,
Any good cause.
Thank you. And I'm going to stop this recording, but I'm just going to say thank you to anyone who stayed with us, and I hope you found something nectar-like, hummingbird nectar in it. I think so, about so many things. So I'm going to pin some of the people in the articles that you mentioned and put a little resource together. But thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing everything, Bill.
My pleasure.